You can earn this limited time exclusive emblem during the Guardian Games event by coming to my live stream at twitch.tv/Mactics and gifting a sub anytime I'm live playing Destiny 2. I'll see you there after the video. Enjoy. Today, we're going to put together a hunter build utilizing the Gifted Conviction exotic chess piece, but the reason why we're doing this specifically is a little interesting. I've always felt that this exotic armor piece is pretty decent, don't get me wrong, but I've never really considered it as one of the top endgame options. However, one of my friends, All the Players, commonly known as ATP, is in my opinion one of the best players in the game, and I have been seeing him use this build basically non-stop for the past year. When it comes to solo flawlessing new dungeons, even solo flawlessing master dungeons in one of their most recent videos. By the way, I have their YouTube in the description. Please go drop them a sub. But I've always known ATP is an exceptional player, so if he is seeing a significant amount of value in Gifted Conviction, then clearly there must be something there that's putting it in the end game top tier echelon that I must be missing. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to not only put together a build for it, but to kind of show the process and the mindset that goes into putting together a build, covering concepts like when to choose which fragments, which aspects, and everything that goes into kind of my thought process of putting together a build that is very viable in endgame. First things first, Gifted Conviction. Activating Ascension or Tempest Strike throws bouncing explosives at nearby targets that jolt and damage them. Jolting nearby targets is also going to grant us damage resistance. The first thing I always like to do whenever we have information that does not have numerical specificity in Destiny itself, I always like to come to the Destiny Data Compendium. I'll drop a link in the description for this. And I always like to look up the exotic armor piece to figure out exactly what we're getting. So right here, I can see that when we have Gifted Conviction, if we have Jolt applied to one target, we get 25% damage resistance. Jolt applied to two targets, we get 40% damage resistance. And if we have it applied to three targets, we get 50% damage resistance, as we can see here in the bottom. Furthermore, it gives us a little bit more specificity. We don't simply get the damage resistance while a target is jolted, and in theory, that would mean that if we kill the jolted target, then there is one less jolted target in the field, and then we lose the damage resistance. That's not how this works. As we can see here, upon inflicting jolt to enemies, you get a stack of resist for 10 seconds. We're not really punished by like jolting a red bar drag and then immediately nuking it. We don't have to intentionally leave things alive so that they can remain jolted, so we keep our stacks. We get the stacks for a timer, which means we can just instant nuke everything whenever we want. We'll still maintain the damage resistance stacks. Another key point right here that's not really mentioned in game is that you have to be within 15 meters of the enemy that you apply jolt to receive the stack of damage resistance. Now that's not usually going to be a problem considering things like Ascension and Tempest Strike, which are going to release the jolting orbs. We usually have to be close range to enemies, but we can technically apply jolt to any enemies through certain weapons, things like jolting feedback, things like volt shot. But I do think that that is an important thing to note, because it means we can't necessarily sit in the back of the map and apply jolt from a very long range, because that will not give us the stack of damage resistance. Sometimes when I read these things as well, I like to test them in game just to confirm that my theoretical understanding of how it works is how it actually works within the game. So for example, let's take this Indebted Kindness with Volt Shot and let's jolt an enemy from very far away while we have Gifted Conviction. In theory, that should not give us a stack of damage resistance. The thing that I'm contemplating right now is because Prismatic is overall a lot better than base Arc. You just have a lot more options, you have better fragments, you have more super options. So what's kind of going through my mind right now is if I am theoretically able to maintain max uptime on my damage resistance stacks with just Ascension and maybe a Volt Shot weapon or a jolting feedback weapon, then I would absolutely rather go Prismatic because the overall subclass is better. If, however, I'm not able to consistently maintain stacks of Jolt, then I think I will kind of drift towards the arc side. But right out of the gate, what's going through my mind is right now I'm like thinking, okay, what are all the ways that I can have Jolt up through my subclass? Well, Ascension is an easy one because not only does Ascension jolt targets in and of itself, but it also releases the orbs from Gifted Conviction, which also jolt. But another thing we can do is we can apply something like Arc Bolt Grenade in conjunction with the Facet of Dominance, where Arc Grenades jolt targets. So right out of the gate, this is two methods that we're going to be able to jolt targets just on Prismatic. Typically, what I'll do is I'll try and fit the rest of this out, go and test it out in a combat scenario, and then if I feel like this is enough to maintain permanent uptime on high stacks of damage resistance with Gifted Conviction, then I'm going the Prismatic route. If that is not the case, then maybe I would try out an Arc version and see if I like the way it feels better. Is it worth running running combination blow? Potentially. I want to figure out that my understanding of gifted conviction is spot on, specifically with the range that you have to be near enemies to receive the damage resistance stuff before I start filling out the rest of the subclass. Typically, the order I like to do my build in is I like to go exotic armor piece, confirm that I have perfect understanding of the exotic armor piece, then I kit out my subclass, then I kit out my weapons, then I kit out my mods. It is a decent idea, though, because they did just recently change Ascension, if I'm not mistaken, correct? Previously, Ascension consumed your class ability, but it wasn't actually like you were using your class ability. So, for example, with us having Gambler's Dodge on right now, previously when you used Ascension, it wouldn't actually proc the effects of Gambler's Dodge. But now that's different, right? So you could theoretically do Ascension, combination blow punch, get your class ability back. Ascension again, procs Gambler's Dodge, gives you back combination blow punch. That could be something a little saucy. So right out the gate, use our air move. Right there, we have resist X3 because we jolted targets with Ascension, plus some of the orbs that flew out from Ascension, thanks to Gift and Conviction, that jolt targets also hit enemies. But now what happens if I kill an enemy, load up this to proc Volt Shot, and then I jolt an enemy from a distance? So right there, I jolted that enemy, but I did not get a stack of resistance. So my theory of, and let's make sure we get one in close range. So boom, right there, we are indeed getting the resistance. So now I kind of want to look at the rest of the subclass. In theory, we could go with that proposed direction that you offered, Moss, where we go combination blow in conjunction with Ascension, because then the idea here, right, is when we cast Ascension, we activate the effects of not only Ascension, but also our Gambler's Dodge, which will give us back our melee ability. And then we can use our melee ability, Combination Blow, to get a final blow, which gives us back our class ability, which then allows us to just go ahead and rinse and repeat that whole process. It doesn't really look all that good because I'm killing everything way too quickly. Everything's dying too fast. If we are going this route, I feel like we don't really need our jolting grenade at all, which means I could actually justify swapping it for something like grapple for more mobility. Correct me if I'm wrong, but with Ascension actually counting as a class ability activation, that also means that it'll proc mods like Bomber. Something that always goes into my mind when it comes to these types of things as well is what type of damage does Ascension count as? So sometimes with abilities like these, they'll count as like grenade damage, for example, or they'll count as melee damage. And the reason that's really important to know is because if they do indeed count as grenade or melee damage, then that can actually significantly affect your mod choices, which impact the rest of your build. So for example, something that I always like to do to test that, to see if an ability is counting as grenade or melee damage, is I always like to throw on firepower and heavy-handed on my gloves, because these create orbs of power whenever I get a grenade final blow or a melee final blow. So what I can do with both of these mods on then is I can run over to an enemy and get a final blow on it with Ascension. And if the enemy drops an orb of power, then automatically I'm like, ooh, interesting. This counts as melee / grenade energy. Now, since none of those enemies dropped an orb of power, that automatically tells me that Ascension doesn't count as melee or grenade energy, which is kind of to be expected because it's utilized using the class ability. But Destiny works in weird ways. I always like to run those tests just to be sure. Okay, so right now, what I'm thinking is I hit this, and then I can do one of those, and then I can do that, and then I can do this. And then every time I use my class ability, I should proc Bomber. Oh, interesting. So, Ascension is actually not proccing class ability mods. So, it's proccing the effects of the class ability itself, like Gambler's Dodge, for example, but it's not proccing class ability mods. Because as you can see, even though I have double Bomber on, when I use Ascension, it's not actually giving me grenade energy. Look at the grenade icon right now. Yeah, it's not actually giving me grenade energy. Another way you can always guarantee this test is with something like Reaper as well, right? So as we all know with Reaper, after casting your class ability, your next weapon final blow generates an orb of power. So what I can do is I can cast my class ability and then get a final blow. And oh, it doesn't make an Orb of Power, which automatically tells me that the use of Ascension does not proc the effects of class ability mods. What I'm wondering, though, is Utility Kickstart works significantly differently, though, because Utility Kickstart doesn't occur when you use your class ability. It occurs when your class ability energy is fully expended. So my theory is that Utility Kickstart should work with Ascension. But again, we can test that. So let's make some orbs, so we can get some stacks of armor charge. And then my class ability icon, boom, right there, Utility Kickstart does indeed work for that. And the reason I'm trying to figure these things out right now is because things like that determine what some of my selections end up being for my other abilities and my fragments and things of that nature. Because, for example, if I know that I'll be able to very easily get a ton of ability regeneration through things like mods, then I don't prioritize fragments that will do that same thing. I prioritize fragments that are going to do some other things. Let's look at our fragments right now. Pretty much immediately, always, any close range build, I'm always going to seat the Facet of Protection. While surrounded by combatants, more resistant to incoming damage, it's kind of a no-brainer on any build that you're going to want to take into endgame content whenever you're going to be close to enemies. I also usually always like the Facet of Purpose as well. Picking up an Orb of Power grants a elemental buff depending on your super. Generally speaking, when you're running Prismatic Hunter, you're always going to go Tether or Golden Gun. If you pick them up when you're on Tether, you're going to get Overshield. If you pick them up while you're on Golden Gun, you're going to get Restoration. You could also go Silence and Squall so that you get Frost Armor. I'm going to come back to this one. I have a feeling that I'm going to want to use Purpose, but I'm going to come back to that one. Generally speaking, I ignore most of the fragments that give you Transcendence energy because they're very negligible benefits. Typically, all of the fragments that give you Transcendence energy or give you bonuses while you're in Transcendence, very, very negligible. You don't get a whole lot going on there. Facet of Hope could be an angle. I do like that a lot, because while you have an elemental buff, which we have amplified 24/7, because anytime we cast Ascension, we get amplified, which is incredible now, because it gives us 15% damage resistance, allows us to access Speed Booster, and it makes enemies more inaccurate against us, which, for all intents and purposes, increases our damage resistance even further, because we're getting hit less. I always like to look at the specific percentages that I get from these things, because some of them can be a little baity. So like, for example, if I come down right here and I look at the Facet of Hope, I get 40% additional base class ability regeneration rate when I have one elemental buff, and I get 60% when I have two elemental buffs. I know that I'm permanently going to have one elemental buff when I have amplified, and 40% is pretty good. So right there, I'm like, okay, that's worthwhile. You can contrast this with something like the Facet of Grace, where if we go in game, defeating targets with kinetic weapons grants you bonus Transcendence energy. You might read that and be like, wow, that actually sounds pretty good if I'm getting a lot of kinetic weapon kills. That sounds like actually pretty powerful. But if you come over here to the Destiny Data Compendium and we actually dig into the numbers, we see kinetic weapon kills grant an additional 2% Transcendence energy, which is like, that's not so hot, you know what I mean? So that's what I mean when I say I like to dig into the numbers, because sometimes certain fragments can read like they're a lot better than they actually are. Invisibility also counts as a buff, correct? Which means that if we're also pairing Stylish Executioner in this build, then we're going to permanently have Amplified and very frequently have Invisibility, which means the 60% base class ability regeneration rate buff that we're going to be getting from Facet of Hope, if we have two elemental buffs, is going to be on pretty frequently. So right now where I'm sitting with this build, I kind of have end game in mind. I have things like solo flawless survivability in mind. I have things like contest mode in mind. That's kind of the lens I'm trying to make this through. And to be completely genuine, whilst the thing that we're going with here, where we have basically an alternating positive feedback loop of permanent ascension and permanent combination blow, it's very, very exceptional for anything on level. This kind of falls off a little bit when you get into endgame, specifically because combination blow really shines when you have some form of melee damage boost with it through something like Liar's Handshake or Spirit of Liar. So since we're not able to incorporate any of those because we have our exotic slot filled by Gifted Conviction and we can't use an exotic class item or the Liar's Handshake exotic, I actually kind of want to lean a little bit away from the combination blow aspect of this and go with something like Threaded Spike. In my opinion, Threaded Spike is by far the best Prismatic Hunter melee, specifically because you get to use it so often. if you know how to do the catch mechanic, if you're decent at that. In some circumstances, you can get it back 100% of the time. And if we end up using Gambler's Dodge, that's actually a non-factor, because when you cast Ascension, it procs Gambler's Dodge, which boom, you get your Threaded Spike back in full. This is so good because it severs targets. And severing targets at base nukes their damage output by 40%, or in this particular episode, which is going on for a while, if we have the Disruptor Spike artifact perk on, it actually takes that 40% damage debuff to 52%. So you're anything that you hit with your Threaded Spike, those enemies deal 52% less damage. You cut their damage in half. And that's every enemy in the game. Champions, bosses, everything. And so when I'm thinking of stuff like contest mode Sundered Doctrine, solo flawless dungeons, things where I have enemies like subjugators that can borderline two-shot me, the idea of being able to chuck a melee ability at them, which I'm going to have up 24/7 and cut their damage by half, that's pretty good. The best ability is survivability. Put it on a t-shirt. I'm not sure if I love Grapple Grenade. I'm a Grapple Grenade addict, but I do want to experiment a little bit with the Arc Bolt Grenade Facet of Dominance pairing to give me a second option to jolt targets to stack up that Gifted Conviction damage resistance is kind of what's going through my head right now. And then for number 5, I could go something like the Facet of Courage, where my light abilities deal increased damage to targets afflicted with darkness debuffs, because then the idea there is I'm throwing my Threaded Spike at everything, and then I can use my Ascension. They'll be severed, which is a darkness debuff, so my Ascension will deal bonus damage, and then my Ascension procs Gambler's Dodge to give me back my Threaded Spike, so I can throw the Threaded Spike at the next pack of enemies, and then that's kind of what I'm thinking right now. But again, let's look at the numbers. So if we look carefully here, Courage is actually only a 10% damage increase to light abilities against targets that are affected by stasis or strand elemental debuffs, which, if you're thinking of something like shooting a Celestial Nighthawk into a raid boss, that's very, very powerful. That's very, very potent. That's a big difference. But for something like casting Ascension, a 10% damage increase is going to be rather negligible. So I'm actually going to walk past the Facet of Courage. Honestly, the biggest thing that's probably calling to me is the Facet of Dawn, where I get Radiant on powered melee hits, specifically because, as we discussed previously, I'm going to have my Threaded Spike up 24/7. Whether it's just through the intrinsic nature of being able to catch it and maintain very high uptime on that melee ability energy, or from the fact that I'm going to be having Ascension very frequently, thanks to the Facet of Hope, and that proccing Gambler's Dodge to give me my Threaded Spike. So that's kind of what's going through my brain right now. There's a Fragment that provides elemental pickups based on damage. Facet of Awakening, rapidly defeating targets with light or darkness damage or super final blows generates an elemental pickup of the matching damage type. Here's where I want to talk about how important opportunity cost is when it comes to build crafting. Because whenever I say, no, I don't really want to incorporate this Fragment into this build, a lot of people always tell me, but why? It gives you a good benefit. And I'm not contesting that. Being able to generate an elemental pickup whenever you rapidly defeat targets with light or darkness damage is solid. However, you can never look at these things in a vacuum. You always have to look at them through the lens of opportunity cost. And what I mean by that is, the question that you ask when you look at a Fragment like this is not, would this be a good Fragment for this build? The question you ask is this Fragment better than any of the 5 fragments that I already have selected? And to me, the answer is no. What elemental pickups could I make right here? I could make Ionic Traces if I rapidly defeat targets with arc damage, which give me a little bit of ability energy for all 3 of my basic abilities. Not really something that I'm worried about because my grenade has a low base cooldown and I can get high discipline. I can get Threaded Spike through the proc of Gambler's Dodge, and I always have Ascension up if I have high mobility and I incorporate the Facet of Hope. And then you could also look at something like my Threaded Spike, which could make Tangles, which Tangles are good, don't get me wrong, but is being able to make Tangles better than bonus weapon damage, jolting targets, which gives me bonus damage resistance, class ability regeneration, which is core to my build, an elemental buff, which is going to be better than any elemental pickup I could possibly have, or straight up bonus damage resistance? In my opinion, no. These fragments currently all synergize really, really well with each other. Dawn and Purpose, giving elemental buffs, both play into Hope, giving me a 60% bonus class ability regeneration rate when I have 2 buffs, which plays into me getting Ascension as much as possible, which plays into my core gameplay loop. So that's kind of the lens I'm thinking of right now. So I like how we have our core class set up right now. I am kind of looking at the super a little bit though, specifically as it relates to the Facet of Purpose. I honestly don't think there's a wrong answer here. I think it's just kind of, it depends on a combination of preference and what activity you're doing. So if you're big on like creating a choke point, having a huge debuff on a boss that you have to DPS, and you're down with getting overshield, those are all very good things. I think Tether's a great play. If you're in a situation where you think you're going to be under a lot of heavy fire and you need constant health regeneration, I think Golden Gun could be a nice play, strictly because it's going to give you restoration when you pick up orbs. And I know Not Swap is on the way, but depending on how that ends up working, if Bungie decides to kind of change their minds on it, in theory, you could even pull Gifted Conviction off real quick, throw on Nighthawk, pop the super, nuke an enemy, swap back. I do kind of like the idea of Silence and Squall a little bit, though. Pick up an Orb of Power to give us Frost Armor, which is going to give us damage resistance, which will stack with the 50% damage resistance that we get from 3 stacks of Jolt of Gifted Conviction, plus the 15% damage resistance that we get from being amplified, plus the damage resistance that we get from Faceted Protection, plus the nerf to enemy damage output when we sever them. And then effectively, it's like the enemies are throwing ping pong balls at you. If I go Destiny Data Compendium, this is an important thing right here. Purpose. If I pick up an Orb of Power with a Stasis Super, it gives me 2 stacks of Frost Armor. And so if I come over here to Stasis and I look at Frost Armor, I see that I get 6.25 damage resistance per stack, which means that on every Orb of Power pickup, I'm going to get approximately 12.5% bonus damage resistance. And then I can juice that up to 25% if I'm able to find another Orb of Power for another 2 stacks before my initial Frost Armor buff runs out. Amplified is giving me 15% damage resistance already. The Faceted Protection is giving me another 15% damage resistance. I'm getting the 50% damage resistance from Gifted Conviction. So another thing I like to contemplate when I'm looking at builds is in situations like these where I'm contemplating taking Silence and Squall so that I can get Frost Armor from Faceted Purpose and get even more damage resistance, something that kind of pops in my mind when I'm putting together a build is this overkill? Am I putting too many eggs into one basket? So the way I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, I have 3 sources of impeccable damage resistance. I could add a 4th that's going to give me another 12.5 to 25% damage resistance, depending on how often I'm going to be able to proc it. So I think of things along the lines like, how often am I going to be able to make Orbs of Power to be able to proc Faceted Purpose? Is it going to be easy to maintain Frost Armor? Do I need it with all of these other damage resistance buffs going on? Or would it be more valuable to have increased hit points, right? Because think of it through this lens, right? What's going to be more valuable? A 200 HP health bar with 75% damage resistance, or a 250 HP health bar with 67% damage resistance? Those are like important considerations to have, right? At this point, I'm basically asking myself the question, through all my damage resistance options, I'm already going to have somewhere in the range of 70, 75, 80. We can actually run the numbers on that. Let's run the numbers on it. Here's the point I'm trying to make. At base, with my current setup, I have 50% DR from Gifted Conviction, 30% DR from Tier 10 Resilience, 15% from Amplified, and 15% from the Faceted Protection. So when I'm trying to decide whether or not I want to run Silence and Squall to link with Faceted Purpose to give me Frost Armor for more DR, or something like Tether to give me extra hit points in the form of Overshield, which actually also gives more damage resistance, or something like Golden Gun to give me Restoration, here's kind of what goes through my mind, right? What is more valuable to me in addition to this base set of buffs, right? An extra 12.5% damage resistance with Frost Armor, an extra 45 hit points with a Void Overshield, or my health bar filling back up with Restoration, in conjunction with the strength of each associated super. So this one is going to be associated with Tether, as indicated by the bow and arrow. This one is going to be associated with Silence and Squall, as indicated by the tornado. And this one is going to be associated with Golden Gun, as indicated by kind of more like Orange Gun, but you know. I think we just landed exactly what we're gonna do. Check out our Void Overshield here. Void Overshield with up to 45 HP for 10 seconds. That's 1 second longer than we would have Frost Armor for an Orb of Power pickup. Overshield has 70% damage resistance against combatants. So not only are we getting 45 bonus hit points, which have a lot more mileage when we have all of these damage resistance buffs, as opposed to if we typically don't have as many. Not only are we getting 45 bonus hit points, but we're also getting another 70% damage resistance on top of all of our existing damage resistance buffs for those 45 hit points. And damage dealt to Void Overshields does not stop health regeneration. So if you kind of think about it in a way, if you're low on HP and you pick up an Orb of Power to get the Overshield, while you're soaking damage to that Overshield from the enemies, your base health bar is going to be restoring because that's not going to stop health regen, which means it kind of, in a way, has some properties of the restoration that you would get from Golden Gun as well. So now that we have our core set up, next thing I like to look at is stats. Number one priority in every single build, no matter what I'm doing, uncircumstantially, tier 10 resilience. So step one, let's make sure that we get ourselves up to tier 10 resilience. Next two things I want to worry about with this build is going to be mobility for increased class ability regeneration so that we can have our ascension up even more, and a decent amount of discipline so that we can have frequent uptime on our grenade, which we don't have a lot of ways to reduce the cooldown of, but we do like the value that we get out of it because of how it works well with the Fast of Dominance, jolting targets, which gives us damage resistance. Now, at the current moment, we're at 1 minute 7 seconds of grenade cooldown, which is pretty good. Another thing that you want to consider when putting your builds together is, are you getting stat bonuses from any of your buffs? Fun fact about Amplified is it gives you a 50-point buff to your mobility. And since we're always going to have Amplified up, we don't really care that much about having any mobility over 50. In fact, at the current moment, I actually have too much, but this is just my... Oh, wait a minute, no. So I can take both of these mobility mods off and swap them both for discipline mods, which is perfect. Because then if I look at my stats, I have tier 10 resilience, I have tier 10 discipline, and whilst I do technically have tier 5 mobility, I'm always going to have Amplified up, which gives me 50 stat point bonus to my mobility, which is going to put me at 100. And at the current moment, I'm looking at ways I can optimize a little bit. So for example, I have 108 discipline. I'm thinking, okay, I can throw on an artifice mod to get up to 111 discipline, which means I can get one of these major discipline mods off for something like, I don't know, maybe an intellect mod, so I have more super uptime. Another couple things I'm looking at right now is I don't really care that much about recovery. I'm gonna have so much damage resistance that I'm not really gonna be taking damage in the first place. And when I have my Void Overshield for picking up an Orb of Power through the Fast of Purpose, that is going to, and taking damage to that Void Overshield doesn't stop damage resistance. I'll be able to get my health regeneration back and going anytime that I have that Void Overshield, which is anytime I pick up an Orb of Power. I'm also going to be invisible quite frequently from Stylish Executioner, which is another time I can chill and let my health regeneration go. So I don't care much about mobility. I don't care at all about strength whatsoever because I get my melee ability back whenever I cast Ascension through my class ability. And since I have tier 10 mobility for all intents and purposes, and I have the Fast of Hope, I always have Ascension up, which means I always have my melee ability up. So strength is kind of inconsequential to me, which means the only thing left over that is left for me to care about is intellect. I usually like to start doing my mods on the chest piece because that usually is the simplest one. Pretty standard. I always like to go a concussive dampener, reduces incoming area of effect damage. Most enemies in Destiny do area of effect damage. So I pretty much always like to do a concussive dampener. And then I do 2 elemental resistances depending on the damage type of the enemies that I'm fighting. Unfortunately, right here, I can't fit both of them. So what I'll do is I'll come over here where I have a discipline mod, which is 3 energy. I'll swap this for the resilience. And then I can swap this resilience for a 3 energy discipline mod. Boom. Now I've opened up enough capacity to fit in 2 elemental ones. Not always necessary. If I was doing void resistance, theoretically, I could just do a harmonic since I have void super on right now, and it does the same thing. Next, let's take a look at the helmet. As we established previously, we're not really getting a lot of final blows with our grenades or our melees. And as we established previously, casting Ascension does not proc class ability usage mods, which means Dynamo is not going to work for us either. So my standard go-to setup is typically always heavy ammo finder, heavy ammo scout, and then a siphon mod matching the element of my primary ammo weapon. Now in this circumstance, we will have to go ahead and swap around our mods a little bit to adjust for cost so that we can fit whatever siphon mod in here we want. We'll leave that empty until we decide what weapons we want to use, but I think theoretically we can use any weapon that we'd like. Then we'll move down to the gloves. Honestly here, since we are not getting a lot of kills with our grenades or our melees, we're not able to make orbs. And I don't really care too much about fast reload speed on my weapons because I'm going to be using mainly my abilities. I'm going to look for mods. These 4 mods right here that give you ability energy back whenever you deal damage with a different ability are exceptional. So the first thing I'll think is, okay, I care a lot about having my class ability up as much as possible. So I'll probably go with mods that give me class ability energy. So something like bolstering detonation, which gives me class ability energy when I cause damage with a grenade, and then the melee equivalent of that. So grants class ability energy when you cause damage with a powerful melee attack, focusing strike. I know for a fact that I'm probably going to keep this one on because it just reinforces the loop of casting my class ability or casting Ascension automatically gives me back my melee because of procs gambler's dodge, which means that I can go ahead and do that loop and then use my melee to give me class ability energy back so I can do it again. However, bolstering detonation, I'm not 100% sure on. I feel like this might be entering the territory of overkill of, do we really need this? Because of how often we're probably going to have our class ability up with all the things that we're fueling it with. So honestly, in a position like this, I'm thinking, okay, my grenade is important to me because it jolts enemies, and jolting enemies is important with gifted conviction, but I don't have a lot of things that are giving me grenade energy right now. So I'm thinking, okay, I have my melee ability up always. So maybe I actually want to slot in something like impact induction, where whenever I hit something with my powered melee, I reduce my grenade cooldown, which allows me to get off more grenades. On the class item, as we discussed, most of these mods are useless for us because most of these mods activate on class ability usage. And as we found out, Ascension doesn't proc class ability based mods. So Reaper, useless. Powerful Attraction, useless. Distribution, Outreach, Bomber, useless. But as we discovered, Utility Kickstart does work because Utility Kickstart doesn't proc when we cast our class ability, it procs when all of our class ability energy is expended, which Ascension does count for. I honestly just kind of like the idea of going double utility kickstart here. Now that I'm kind of looking at this, I really like the idea of having some way to generate orbs of power other than our siphon mod up top here. So I think I would want to find a way to free up a stat point here. So I think I might do a resilience mod here, which allows me to take this resilience mod off, which allows me to put in heavy-handed. And then here I can go... I can only fit a 3 cost. Oh, actually, no. I can do a minor intellect mod and still keep tier 4 intellect. So I like what we got going on there. So now we have 2 ways to generate orbs of power. Would you perhaps want something, Max, still to scoop up orbs where you won't have to go find them? No, I do not want powerful attraction because Ascension does not proc powerful attraction. So now that I'm looking at the boots, I kind of have 2 things that are in my brain right now. Thing number 1 is my orb of power production is a little bit lower than I'm used to, which means I want to get more mileage out of every single orb of power when it comes to being armor charged, so I can get more mileage out of the utility kickstarts. As such, first thing that my brain goes to is stacks on stacks. So at least for armor charge purposes, every orb of power pickup counts as 2 instead of 1. Means I only have to pick up 2 orbs of power for max stacks for utility kickstart instead of 3. Next, I'm going back to my problem of I don't have a lot of things that are giving me grenade ability energy. So the best thing I can solve here is going double innervation. Where if I swing over here to the Destiny Data Compendium and I look up innervation, if I have 2 copies, I'm going to get 13% grenade ability energy per orb of power pickup. 3% for a whole mod slot, though. I do realize that you might think that utilizing a whole extra mod slot just to get an extra 3% ability energy is maybe not the greatest thing. But if we're looking at the spread we got right here, what else are we going to put in here? We don't care about insulation because we already have so many things going into our class ability cooldown. We don't care about invigoration at all because we're getting our melee back instantly when we use our class ability. You could make the argument that you would like better already or recuperation. I'm not sure how necessary. Honestly, I think the angle of recuperation or better already is probably good. I'm always a little bit torn when picking between better already and recuperation, because better already, when you pick up an orb, it immediately begins health regeneration. The problem that people typically run into with this mod, though, is if you pick up an orb and then you immediately take a single point of damage, that health regeneration, boom, done, stops. Recuperation gives you a flat 70 HP. Now, there's 2 trains of thought that you could have when you look at these 2 mods. And honestly, I think both of them would be correct. Train of thought number 1 is, I have so much damage resistance that all I need is big chunks of health. I'm going to take the recuperation, get the 70 HP bump. I have enough damage resistance that I'm going to be perfectly good. And you would be right, honestly. I don't disagree with that. But I think the argument for better already is also right. Because we have something like Stylish Executioner, which makes us invisible anytime we kill a debuffed enemy, which we can do for any enemy that is jolted, which everything's going to be jolted. We can do through any enemy that's severed, which every enemy is going to be severed. And if we pick up an orb while we're invisible, enemies aren't going to shoot at us, which means every time we're invisible and we run over an orb, boom, guaranteed full health regen, because we're going to proc better already, kicks off our health regen, nothing's going to hit us while we're in that invisibility. So honestly, I think this is a situation where I think you could go either way. I'm going to try out both of them. As far as weapons go, honestly, I feel like you can use literally whatever weapons you want in this build. I think things that also allow you to jolt enemies are nice. So weapons with perks like Volt Shot, weapons with perks like Jolting Feedback. However, I think you'll be good to go no matter what. I want to do my first trial run of this build without anything that can jolt enemy targets and see how high my damage resistance gifted conviction uptime is. Okay. Whee! Okay, so we can't really see it on my buff bar because I have too many buffs, but we have resist X2. Let's hit that. So we get to resist X3 and refresh the timer. Oh! Wait, okay, so I hit him. 1 orb of power pickup. Now my health regeneration starts. Easy peasy.
What are you aiming at? What are you aiming at?
Okay. Let's throw this grenade. Completely miss it. There's our resist X2. This is so good because it jolts basically everything. Which means anytime you kill an enemy, because it's jolted, you're going to go invis from stylish. Why are they... Why is he blinded? Why is he not allowed to play the game? What do I got going on that's blinding him? Defeating an exhausted or severed target with arc damage release a blinding burst. Ah, that makes this even better this episode. I like what we got going on right now. I want to make sure that I always use my melee ability before I use my ascension as well. Uh-oh. Ah! Didn't see them there. All right, now I really want to try and kill these 2 ogres. Get one of those. Debuff him so that I can kill him, which he's severed. So that's a debuff. So proc stylish. Whoa. There's a little risky business right there. It's my first time, very first time using the build, so I'm a little unacquainted. But I would say that's going pretty well so far. I mean, I think soloing probably what I would say is one of the hardest grandmasters in the game with a build that I've never used before. That's a tall order. And I feel like we're fulfilling that order pretty decently right now. I trolled right there a little bit by using my ascension before I used my melee ability, because the ascension would have given me back my melee ability. But live and learn. Throw that to get more damage resistance because it jolts everything. I'm noticing something as well. I could be wrong. I think you're only allowed to get a maximum of 2 gifted conviction resistance stacks per ability usage. I could be wrong on that. But like here, if I run into this cluster, there's 4 enemies right there. Yeah, I only get resist X2. So the only way to get resist X3 is with the usage of 2 different jolting abilities. Keeping this platform clear is very interesting on solo. I'm gonna let my invis tick, and then we have a tether. Throw the dart. Surely I'm gonna kill something with the dart. This is where I'm kind of going full offensive. While my tether's out, should be able to keep everything at bay. Make sure we're continuously ripping the ascension for amplified and for our damage resistance procs. I want to get a little bit of health back. Gonna try and let my health regen while my invisibility's cooking. Get that grenade on the wall there. Make an orb, so now I have a better already proc if I want it. Make sure we keep the Centurions down, because their darts are very scary. That's a mine Centurion right there, so that's something I gotta keep my eye out for. I almost have my super back. All right, for this room, I want to do what I'm gonna call limit testing, where I'm just gonna kind of play like a psychopath and see how long it takes for them to kill me. Like, they will kill me at some point, but I'm gonna play like an idiot. I mean, I'm not gonna like intentionally try to die, but I'm not like, no retreating, basically. Give me all that damage resistance, please. That's an unstop ogre. This is a bit of a problem. Oh! I could have done way better. I don't know how my unstop shot wasn't ready there. That's just kind of a troll on my part. So there is not only the build we threw together real quick, but also the philosophies that go into making a build in Destiny 2, or at least the philosophies that I typically incorporate whenever I'm making a build. There's probably some tweaks that I can do on this. I really love the build as well, so you're probably going to see me iterate on this a little bit and make a full build guide video for it, so make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want to see that. And once again, I do want to give a shout out to all the players, ATP, who was was the inspiration for me wanting to try this out. He's a good friend, definitely one of the top players in the game, and I would highly appreciate it if you go over to his channel, drop him a like on some of his videos, and subscribe to his channel. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a great day.